Aloha and welcome to Kūpuna, that is New Kūpuna, a wordplay on Kapunaho. I'm Chris Yano, your host, and this is a talk story podcast by, for, and about us, the Punahou class of '69. It's a privilege to reach this age and realize, hey, we are the Kūpuna now. What kinds of responsibilities do we take on in this position, and what kind of legacy might we, as Kūpunaho, offer? Our guest today is Barbara Pope, an accomplished book designer and committed contributor to what I'll call the resistant life and culture of Hawaii, to what she calls the transformative potential of writing, publishing, and reading. She is a founding partner with Punahou alum Maile Meyer of Aipohaku Press. The name of the press refers to a line in one of the most famous songs of Native Hawaiian resistance, Kaulana Napua, speaking to the people's willingness to, quote, eat stones rather than surrender the kingdom. And besides Aipohaku Press, Barbara's work has been foundational to establishing a growing body of printed knowledge of Hawaii. Welcome, Barbara.
Thank you.
Now, you grew up in Maunawili, and you currently live there. And can you tell us something about how the place in which you grew up is a part of you? I'm just assuming that. So then and now, can you say something about Barbara Pope in Maunawili?
Yes, it's kind of huge. So I was lucky enough to be born and raised there when Maunawili was very rural. And my grandparents lived right on the other side of Olomana, and they had moved into the area in 1928. So my mom grew up on the slopes of Olomana, right on the other side of the hill. So she had a connection to Maunawili even as a girl. So Maunawili really had a separate feel from Kailua. It was much more rural, a little bit off the beaten track, and maybe the presence of Kuleana families was in some ways more evident there, or at least a little more connected to almost a 19th century lifestyle. So I think that was huge for me growing up because I got a glimpse of that. So that by the 70s, when those values were reemerging and we were rediscovering them as people in our 20s, I had something to connect to there. And I think that definitely influenced my life and work, even though I actually lived in New York City for several years.
Now, you mentioned Kuleana families. Was your family one of them?
No.
Okay.
My family's Portuguese. And
I didn't know that.
Had an affinity for, especially my grandfather, a great respect for the Hawaiian community and worked with them. And that was always passed down to me, that was a gift and very valuable, and that knowledge that came to him from them was really important.
Yeah. How was that conveyed to you?
Largely from his behavior. So he actually took care of the grounds at Kauailoa, which is today's Oahu Youth Correctional Facility, which was an agricultural place in those days. But the water for Kauailoa came from Maunawili, from a spring. And he took care of the spring. And also, together with some of the Kuleana families, they cared for the springs in the back of Maunawili. So when he would go up Mauka and Maunawili, the Kuleana families were kind of the gateway to the back of the valley. And these are the families that were associated with Maunawili Ranch, which was the Boyd Ranch in the 19th century, where Liliʻu wrote Aloha Oi. And he would stop there. And sometimes I went with him. So he would stop there and visit and talk story with the Ane family, the Kaneʻaupio family, the Kaleleiki family, about what had been going on since he had last been there, which could have been a week ago or a month ago, depending on what was up. And, they would talk story about what had happened, what needed care, what was going on. So there was a lot of connected knowledge from the 19th century to the early 20th century and mid 20th century. And these guys were all sharing sharing about that because it was an important agricultural and forestry and most important watershed.
Mm-hmm.
So how it passed on to me was watching his behavior, always deferential, always respectful, always knowing to connect with them about the knowledge of the place. And he was a very humble man, but also telling me directly that that was important.
That's wonderful. Now, I understand you went to school on Windward Side and then entered Punahou in 9th grade, correct?
Correct.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
What was your reaction to entering in this big, I'll call it a fancy school,
Mm-hmm.
entering into Punahou at that age?
Well, I was a little prepared because I have two older sisters, and they both, my middle sister was a senior that year. My oldest sister graduated in 1962. So I was familiar with Punahou, but I don't think I'd ever been on the campus until I went for my test and my interview. I was very unhappy when I started there. I went home and cried every day. I hated it, but not for long. I was probably unhappy for like 3 months.
That's a long time, though, at that age. 3 months feels like forever.
Yeah.
What was the source of your tears mostly?
It was just big, and I felt out of place and frightened, and everything was very unfamiliar. I'd been in a school for how many years? 9 years at St. Anthony's, and we were a pretty tight-knit little group. Mm-hmm. So it was hard for me to figure out how to navigate it. But I have a funny story about it. It's kind of silly, but I'll tell it anyway because it stood out to me at the time. I knew none of the names there. The names meant nothing to me. I had a hard time keeping them straight. Bingham, Alexander, whatever it was not part of my world. But there was one name I did know, and that was Wilder. I knew Wilder Avenue. And the reason I knew Wilder was twofold. One, my great uncle had been a driver for the Wilder family. He drove a hack. And two, I often would drive out along Ko'olapoko with my grandfather. And whenever we drove by Kualoa, he would point out the old mill there, the ruin of the old mill, and tell me the story of the young Wilder boy who had very tragically died in the mill. And that made a huge impression, that story. So when I got there, Wilder was a name that resonated with me. Like, okay, I know this name.
I mean, it's amazing. We've done a number of these interviews, and I'd say most of the people we spoke with did not go to Punahou from kindergarten.
Right.
And so everybody talks about their kind of entry story into Punahou. Mm-hmm. And for many people, it was an entry of an intimidation, right, of tears, mm-hmm, just as you're saying. I mean, for me, I was amazed to have classmates whose last names were the names of streets, like Lowry
right.
Avenue. It was like, what?
Exactly. Yeah, right.
But, so thank you for that. And I understand since then you've actually been one of the designers in 2 of the significant Punahou kind, mm-hmm, of historical publications. Can you tell me something about that process?
Yeah. So Nelson and I worked on the first book, 91, I think it was. So in addition to doing the design, I think, we really worked together on and with the administration and faculty on thinking through the direction the book was going to go in. Mm-hmm. And it was a really great experience because they gave us a lot of leeway. Oh. There were some restrictions, and we had to include certain things that we didn't feel 100% comfortable about. But in general, they left us alone. We both knew McPhee from our senior year.
Yeah.
And, Nelson was the guy that greeted him at the airport when he arrived, of course.
That sounds very Nelson Foster.
Exactly, yeah. But I, knew him that year as well, and not really followed up with him after that. But we both had a lot of opportunity to talk to him
Mhm.
and to really look at what his legacy had been. So it was a really great experience for me. And in fact, I had never considered sending my daughter to Punahou for the younger grades.
Uh-huh.
I just never thought that wasn't part of it for me at all. But in working on the book, I was so impressed with the junior school and what
Oh.
was going on there that I was like, oh, well, I'd be crazy not to try this. So that was a kind of a revelation for me. But it also was the first time that I had a close look at the archives and
Oh.
began looking at both their documents and their visual record. And that was fabulous. And I was working really closely with Mary Judd. So that was an eye-opener. And that's when I first saw the Hawaiian imprint material, the missionary press material holdings at Punahou, which are fantastic, as well as the early images and documents.
Mhm.
And then when Carlene contacted me, how many years later, 25 years
25
later,
years.
my first reaction was, what? You guys don't want me. You already did a book. Really? Why do you want me? Anyway, I'm, of course, really happy that they did, because that was an equally amazing experience to take a look at the school again and also look at Jim Scott's contribution and legacy, but also I know that from the very beginning of that assignment, it was really clear to me that what was important is to reestablish the name Kūpuna and have that be foremost. And it was the right thing for everyone, right from the get-go. And that was thrilling.
And we have two significant, really important books for all of us to consider. I'm not sure if all the alumni have seen these two books, but if you haven't yet, please do. It gives you a sense of place of the school and what it has been about, what it maybe perhaps will be about in even 25 years hence. Now, I know that you were in New York City studying at Columbia, but you returned to Hawaii was it 1983 or in the 80s?
83.
Yeah, 83.
Yeah.
What brought you back?
I got a call from Bishop Museum while I was in New York asking if I would be interested in doing the design production for ʻŌlelo Noʻeau, Mary Kawena Pukui's book of traditional sayings. And I want to say also that the reason they contacted me is that Dave Kemble recommended me, who was a year ahead of us in Punahou. And that has a nice synergy, because I had actually referred Dave to the Bishop Museum in the 70s, because I had been told about a job there that someone thought I was appropriate for, and I was about to leave to go to Chicago. And I said, well, I can't take it, but I know someone who might be interested. And he took the job and spent his entire career at the museum. So he did a kind of return favor for me by putting my name forth for ʻŌlelo Noʻeau, and the press director came to New York City. He was on a trip, and we met, and they gave me the job.
And that was
I didn't
enough
intend to move.
take you away from New York City.
At that point, I didn't intend to move. I just came out to meet and talk. And I have led a very unplanned life and never had a 5-year plan. But we were in a Columbia University apartment, and I was married, and we had a fantastic apartment that I was able to hang on to, because I actually was teaching drawing at Columbia during that period. But we knew we were going to lose it. But I was also hapai at the time. And I remember really vividly walking down Broadway and watching these young women with their babies in baby carriages on the sidewalk. It was like really grungy, and thinking, really? I don't think I want to do this. That logged in, and then I came out and saw the scope of the project, and everything really just came together. My husband took a leave of absence from his job, and we thought we'd come out and spend, a year and finish the book, have the baby, go back, maybe, and we just never went back.
That's so interesting, because I think it is when you are welcoming or thinking about the next generation that maybe your attitudes towards something called home might shift.
Right.
And you think, what do I want?
And here I had all the support services of my sisters and my mother and auntie, and
that sense of family and that sense of place is just so important when you're thinking about the next generation.
To re-enter, to come home, it's never easy to re-enter this place after being away. It's very hard, I think. Everybody knows that. But to re-enter it with the context of working on ʻŌlelo Noʻeau was really a gift. Any time I work on a book, I really enter into that world, right? So much so that I can walk outside and wonder, why does it look like this? It should be like looking the way, the project I'm working on is talking about. I had to pay really a lot of attention to everything in that text. And it's the most lofty to the most base aspects of Hawaiian culture. So it put me right into that range and right into the depth of that world. Without my having to work at it. It put me into that cauldron in a way.
So you were plunged into
I was pretty plunged into it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And the result is stunning. And you've continued that plunge, it seems, ever since. And so tell me a little bit something about maybe I'm wanting to ask two things. One of them is about your relationship to books. And, for some people, they may say books is kind of outdated. Young people aren't reading books. But tell me about your relationship to books and why books seem to be so important for you and your creative thought process.
Well, to begin with, one of the things about living in Maunawili as children is that we were a little isolated. So books were important to us, especially to my sister Deborah and I. We loved going to the library. We read all the time. And we spent a lot of time outdoors, but we spent a lot of time reading. So really from the beginning, for me, from a very young age, books were important. But the reason I moved into books from a graphic design sort of aesthetic side of things really had to do with the way that it combined intellectual integrity and aesthetic integrity and history. I did discover typography, actually here in Hamilton Library, but extremely so when I was in New York, and began to really look at the aesthetics of typography and the design traditions behind it, and the printmaking aspect of it. So in studio work, I was still at that time drawing and doing printmaking, and I began to incorporate typography into printmaking. And I think one of the reasons Bishop Museum connected with me was that a lot of typographic examples for type designers in the 20th century and 19th century, texts were in Latin, and Latin has a lot of vowels. It's a very beautiful written language. And I spent a lot of time looking at that and looking at type design in terms of how it worked from a sort of micro level, and began working a little bit with Hawaiian language because of it's so full of vowels. Right. So it had a very similar rhythm to Latin. And I'd started doing some of that work with printmaking, and I was able to show, maybe I had shown Dave that, I'm not even sure at this point, but I had some of that to show, which I think actually made a difference.
Now, explain to me, because why vowels are so critical to typography.
Well, it's not that vowels are critical. I mean, vowels and all aspects of the alphabet are. But if you're looking at traditional type design, which in my case, it was primarily coming out of Europe, but also the United States, very strong tradition there. The European foundries are often setting things in Latin, and consequently a lot of vowels. So the working out of a type design, a lot of the foundation of it has to do with the relationship space and weight wise with the vowels, and the consonants come in as a kind of a bell note almost.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
So the vowels become kind of the visual scaffolding of the page.
Right. Which is very true in Hawaiian.
Yeah. Now, the other question I had was your relationship to Hawaii. And since so much of your publications have been really, as I said in the intro, really foundational to our printed knowledge of this place that we are calling home, can you say something about home to you, Hawaii to you, and why this I think your commitment to this place and its history permeates your work so strongly?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with the times that we grew up in. By the time we were in high school, I think all of us were very aware of what we were losing and how things were changing. And that became underscored even more in the 70s. That aspect of understanding that if we don't take the time to learn what came before and how it's impacting what's going on now, and things are changing so incredibly quickly that we may not even have that opportunity to learn, because that information, that the place may be gone, the language may be gone, the document that held it, or the recollection of the mele that had that information, it could be gone. It's time to start paying attention. And it's time to learn the things that we didn't learn as children, because the emphasis was not on looking to the past. Even if that was a value within our families, that was not supported really anywhere else in a strong way. I think that's what would have spurred me to do that. And even for me, going to school, when I was at Columbia, I took as much art history as anything else, and I was in primitive art. So it was Pacific and Southeast Asian tribal, African primarily. But a big reason for me to be there was to look at the scholarship on the Pacific. So even though I was in New York, I still was engaged in that aspect of things. I think the other thing for me that ties into both focusing on aspects of Hawaiian culture and history is that whole notion of being a lifelong learner is very me. That's it. I mean, every project I work on is like taking a class. And that's so important to me, and I love it. I'm always learning something new. It's kind of amazing. I mean, people always say to me, "When are you going to retire?" I'm like, I don't know. So, yeah, I'm not sure I answered your question.
No. But what I heard in your response was really how we are a product of our times, aren't we? I mean, I remember, of course, we all graduated from Puna at the same time, and every summer I'd come back. There'd be both a kind of sense of loss every time I saw all those cranes up in Waikiki
Mm-hmm.
and yet another high rise being built, as well as a source of celebration. And I remember going to Waikiki, hearing Gabby, hearing
Right.
all that Hawaiian music, being so
Mm-hmm.
excited to hear Peter
Yeah.
Moon's, rock riffs,
Mm-hmm.
etc. Right?
Yeah.
Um, and so it's both at the same time. It's loss as well as celebration.
Exactly.
And, last question. So now we are 70 plus,
Mm-hmm.
which many would say, okay, that's about a Kūpuna time.
Right.
And given that, what would you like your kind of, I don't know, lesson for future generations, or maybe what would you like that legacy to be for you personally?
I do think that I think it's really important to understand history and learn the moʻolelo, learn the stories, remember the stories that we were told, pass them on, because, and that has to do also with engaging with community and engaging with place, because anytime you delve into moʻolelo here, there is a very strong place association. So the idea of what is that connection there? It's a huge connection. So that very huge connection between moʻolelo, history, place, and the notion of life of the land
Mhm.
is, I think that's critical for us. And I think it's really important that we pass on to the next generation, either, within our families and within our community, how really important that is, because without it, it's very thin and very one-dimensional, and there's no embedded wisdom to draw on. And I think we have lived to see what happens when decisions are made and communities are regarded without that deeper dimension of really looking at the stories, looking at the moʻolelo, investigating the place. And all of those things underscore again and again and again the need to act, the need to raise your own voice, the need to not be complacent and respect your own truth about what you know and be willing to put it forth. I think those things are going to be really critical for the islands. And we have so many good examples of people that have done that in our lifetime and in the 19th century.
Right. And it sounds a little bit like you're invoking the aipohaku. Again, the stone eaters, right?
Yes. Although the other aspect of eating stones is the deliciousness of them. So it's dual.
I'm sorry, I said that was my last question, but I just have one little follow-up question. Because you mentioned that the Kuleana families, where you grew up in Maunawili, and that your family was not one of those, but had great respect. Your grandfather had great respect for them. So I guess my question is, whose moʻolelo are these?
I think that the moʻolelo that come down to us, all of us as residents here, I'm talking about the Hawaiian moʻolelo, the traditional stories that are sometimes documented in the newspapers, appear in the mele, are carried within the Kuleana families, are part of the ancient sites. Each of those sites touches on an aspect of a moʻolelo. It's all there. It's very much here. But I'm actually talking about the moʻolelo that we have, having been born and raised here.
Okay.
And anyone coming into this place.
Well, thank you so much, Barbara. I learned a lot. And, I just want to recognize and applaud your own eating of stones, if you want to put it that way, whether it's with tears or with the kind of deliciousness that you speak of, because I think it's that mixture that really makes them so valuable. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Mahalo for listening. This has been Kūpuna, a talk story podcast by, for, and about us, the Punahou class of 69. I'm your host, Cristiano, with production help from Carlene Tani and Sue Au Doyle. I hope that listening to these interviews might prompt each of us to reflect on those pivotal experiences and insights that make up our own lives and to share them with families and friends. This is our responsibility, our ongoing legacy. So until next time, ahui o.